Hello, everyone. I'm Casey. Mrs. Gray's story today is more than just an investigation into a crime. It is the weary, painful sigh of a mother who spent her whole life favoring one child, only to discover that fairness is the only thread that keeps a family from unraveling. Please, join me as we listen to Mrs. Gray's own account of those stormy days. Holding that luxury cruise ticket in my small Florida kitchen, I truly believed I was the luckiest mother in the world. David had that gentle smile I had always adored, and Rachel, who was usually so careful with every penny, was being uncharacteristically warm and attentive. But looking through the lens of someone who spent half her life as a Coast Guard investigator, I started to feel the dark, jagged swells churning silently beneath that calm surface. "Happy birthday, Mom. You deserve the very best," David said as he hugged me. But that warmth felt hollow, missing the sincerity I had spent 30 years trying to find in him. Rachel was practically pushing me to cancel my Wednesday appointment with my lawyer, Harriet, insisting we had to get on that ship immediately for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Once we were in cabin 8042 at the far end of a deserted hallway, I stood alone by the balcony door and noticed the safety latch had been deliberately loosened. The sea breeze was howling through the gap, but the chill I felt did not come from the Atlantic. I happened to glance at a stack of papers in Rachel's handbag, and my heart stopped. It was a $500,000 life insurance policy in my name. The signature at the bottom was a clumsy forgery. A handwriting I knew all too well belonged to my own son, David. My chest tightened, as if 1,000 needles were piercing my pride as a mother. As I stood frozen in that room, surrounded by luxury that now felt like a tomb, my phone buzzed. It was Emma. "Mom, I saw you did not answer my texts, so I rushed down to the port," she said, her voice trembling with worry. "I was so afraid you left without your blood pressure medicine." This was the daughter I had constantly pushed aside, the one I forced to give up every opportunity so her brother could succeed. I had never even given her a word of praise. Yet here I was, realizing the son I loved most was planning to toss me into the dark waves, while the child I neglected was the only one worried about my next breath. I looked in the mirror and saw an old woman who had built her own trap through years of blind favoritism. The tears finally came, not because I was afraid to die, but because the truth was so much more bitter than the end. The rhythmic thumping of the waves against the hull of the ship felt like a steady heartbeat, yet it could not quiet the storm raging inside my soul. I sank into the plush velvet chair in my cabin, my hands trembling as I opened the family photo album I had always kept like a treasure. The dim yellow light caught the faces in those old pictures, and for the first time in 30 years, I finally saw the scars I had carved into my daughter's heart. I flipped through photos of David at his graduation from a prestigious private school in Austin. To get him that degree, I spent over $100,000 on tuition and living costs without a second thought. Meanwhile, Emma attended a local college and worked double shifts at a convenience store just to pay for her books. When David wanted to buy his first home, I reached into my retirement savings and handed him $50,000 for a down payment. But when Emma asked for a mere $2,000 to fix her leaking roof after Hurricane Ian devastated our part of Florida, I cold-heartedly told her she needed to learn to be independent, like her brother. The bitter truth is that David was never independent. He was only good at taking what I worked for, while Emma was the one truly standing on her own. The memories returned like sharp stabs of a knife. I remembered David's 18th birthday at the best steakhouse in town, a lavish celebration for my golden boy. For Emma's 18th, I had completely forgotten her day, until I saw a small cake at Walmart while I was on my way to pick David up from the airport. I told her she should be more like him, that she should make me proud, and that he was the real future of this family. Every time I said those things, Emma just lowered her head, her thin shoulders shaking, but she never said a word to defend herself. That silence is what is suffocating me now. I have been so blind, raising a monster with my favoritism, while driving away an angel with my coldness. David and Rachel think they can use this luxury trip to end my life and take what is left of my savings. They think an old woman who needs her blood pressure medicine is an easy target. But I will not let that happen. I am not just a victim anymore. I am a mother who has finally woken up. I have to live to see justice done and to finally give Emma the fairness she has deserved for a lifetime. A plan is starting to form in the quiet of this room, not out of a need for revenge, but to put things right and find real love in this house again. After I ended the call with Emma, I stood still for a long time, staring out at the vast, dark Atlantic through the thick, reinforced glass of this expensive cabin. The rhythmic hum of the ship's engines vibrated through the floorboards, a constant reminder that I was being carried further away from everything I knew. In the quiet, Emma's voice seemed to linger in the air, a soft echo that reminded me that even in the middle of this cold, calculated trap, I still had a lifeline. It was a connection I had nearly severed myself through years of neglect and blind devotion to a son who did not deserve it. I took a deep, shaky breath, feeling the weight of the phone in my palm, and I decided to do something I had not truly done in 30 years. I was going to listen to my daughter. I found a quiet, dimly lit corner in the ship's library lounge, where the heavy curtains muffled the sounds of the wealthy travelers outside. I called her back. This time, I did not start by bragging about David's supposed successes or complaining about my blood pressure medicine. Instead, I asked her how her work at the city library was going. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end that made my heart ache, a silence born from years of her being invisible to me. Then, tentatively, she began to speak. She told me she had been promoted to manager of the special archives and rare collections. While I had been busy celebrating David's imaginary achievements, my daughter had become a respected professional in our community. She spoke about her volunteer work at the animal shelter in Palm Beach County every Saturday night, and how she was saving up for a certification in historical estate appraisal. Listening to her talk about preserving the past, I realized with a crushing sense of shame that I had missed out on the beautiful, dedicated soul she had become. "Emma," I said, cutting through her gentle words, "I am so sorry for everything." The silence that followed was even heavier than before, a testament to the deep wounds I had inflicted with my favoritism. I did not wait for her to forgive me. I just kept going. I told her that as soon as I got back to Florida, I wanted us to have a real dinner together at that little seafood place on the beach she always loved, just the two of us. I told her I had a promise to give her, something I wanted to hand to her myself. I heard her catch her breath, a tiny fractured sob that she tried to hide. She did not cheer or celebrate, and that was the hardest part to hear. It showed me just how much ground I had lost. But when she whispered, "Yes, Mom," it felt like the first ray of morning sun hitting the coast after a long, dark storm. I set the phone down and looked at my reflection in the cabin window. The woman looking back was not just a grieving widow or a victim of a cruel scam. She was a former investigator, a woman who used to know how to read the tides and spot a liar from a mile away. I realized then that David was never my future, and Emma was never the spare child. True fairness is not about dividing up a bank account. It is about returning respect and love to the one who actually earned it. I was not just going to survive this trip to confront Rachel. I was going to live to start a new chapter where Emma finally stood in the light where she belonged. Have you ever realized you were too hard on the child who stayed by your side while you were chasing the approval of the one who did not care? Mrs. Gray woke up just in time. But will forgiveness be that easy? Share your thoughts on family favoritism in the comments below. The sunset over the Gulf of Mexico was breathtaking, casting a deep orange glow across the water that looked almost too perfect, like a filtered photograph on a travel brochure. It was beautiful, but it felt artificial, much like the smile Rachel wore as she made her way toward me on the 10th floor deck. I had just tucked my phone into my pocket after speaking with Emma, and the warmth of our conversation still lingered in my chest, a small spark of hope I had not felt in years. But as I watched my daughter-in-law approach, her expensive heels clicking rhythmically against the deck, her movements graceful and filled with a practiced confidence, I knew the peaceful bubble I was in was about to be tested. I tightened my grip on the cold metal railing of the ship, taking a deep, steadying breath. I could feel the old instincts of a Coast Guard investigator beginning to stir in my blood, a familiar sense of alertness that I had let go dormant for far too long. "Mom, there you are," Rachel said, her voice sounding as sweet as clover honey, yet her eyes were sharp, scanning my face with a precision that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. "David and I have been looking everywhere for you. We have reservations at the most exclusive restaurant on the ship, and we simply cannot go without the guest of honor." She reached out and touched my arm, a gesture that was supposed to seem affectionate, but I felt the weight of it as a probe, a way to gauge my mood. "I noticed you were on the phone just now," she continued, her tone light but pointed. "You look so emotional. Please tell me Emma hasn't been calling you again, just to complain or beg for more help." Her words were tossed out like a stray feather, seemingly harmless, but I knew there was a needle dipped in poison hidden inside, designed to immediately devalue my daughter. I did not give her the satisfaction of an immediate reaction. Instead, I turned my gaze back to the horizon, watching the whitecaps chase each other across the deep blue expanse. "I was just speaking with Emma, and she has actually been promoted," I replied, my voice coming out with a calmness that surprised even me. Rachel's expression flickered for a fraction of a second, a tiny crack in her polished mask, before she quickly draped herself in a cloak of manufactured sadness. "Oh well, I suppose I am happy for her," she sighed, dabbing at the corner of her eye where not a single tear resided. "But Mom, you have to understand the pressure David is under right now. He has worked himself to the point of exhaustion just to afford this cruise for you. We have sacrificed so much of our own lives, giving up things we wanted just to see you happy." She started to sniffle, a classic performance I had seen 100 times before. "And yet lately, you have been so cold toward us. Has Emma been filling your head with lies? It breaks my heart to think you would doubt us after everything we have done." This was the guilt trip she had used for years, a weapon designed to make me feel like a cruel, ungrateful mother if I did not bend to their will. I turned fully to face her, looking directly into her eyes with the same unwavering stare I used to use when facing the most stubborn smugglers out on the open sea. "Rachel, I am not changing because of what anyone said," I told her, my voice firm and grounded. "I am simply starting to look at everything through the lens of fairness." I saw her flinch slightly, her lips pressing into a thin, hard line. "David has received so much from me over the years, from his private school tuition to the very apartment you both live in now. Meanwhile, Emma has been forced to navigate life entirely on her own for far too long. I was wrong to let her struggle, while I poured everything into David, and I intend to fix that imbalance, starting now. Rachel let out a forced, jagged laugh, her voice rising in pitch as her frustration began to leak through the cracks of her persona. Fairness? Mom, look at the reality. David is the eldest son. He has status and a brilliant future ahead of him. Emma is just a lowly librarian in some dusty old building. Isn't it only natural to invest in the child who actually has the talent to succeed? She was desperate now, clinging to the elitist logic she used to justify her greed. Status and talent do not give anyone the right to deceive their mother, Rachel, I said, my voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous in its quiet intensity. I let the words hang in the air, a silent acknowledgement of the forged insurance policy I knew was hidden in her luggage. Rachel gasped, her mouth hanging open as she struggled to find a rebuttal that wouldn't incriminate her. For the first time in our history, she saw that I wasn't going to apologize or retreat. I was exposing the favoritism she had exploited for so long. I didn't give her a chance to recover or spin another web of lies. I am feeling a bit tired, so I will be retiring to my cabin. I won't be joining you and David for dinner tonight. Please do not come looking for me, I said, effectively ending the conversation on my own terms. I walked away, keeping my back straight and my head held high, leaving Rachel standing alone on the deck with her simmering rage hidden behind a mask of expensive makeup. I knew that from this moment on, the battle had truly begun. But strangely enough, I no longer felt the familiar weight of fear or the hollow ache of guilt. I felt like myself again. That night, the ocean suddenly turned violent. The luxury cruise ship, usually so smooth and steady, began to rock and sway, causing the fine crystal glasses in my cabin to clink against each other with a frantic, metallic ring. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, my heart heavy with a premonition of danger, when a series of thunderous, demanding knocks rattled the door. Rachel burst inside. The corporate, polished smile she had worn for years was gone, replaced by bloodshot eyes and a breath that reeked of pure, unadulterated fury. She slammed a file folder down onto the table, documents I had deliberately left where they could be found. "How do you explain this?" Rachel screamed, her voice cracking as the wind howled through the slight gap in the balcony door. It was the draft of my new will, something I had just coordinated with my lawyer over encrypted email. It clearly stated that 70% of my assets would be placed into a trust for Emma and various veterans' charities, with only the remainder left for David. "You are throwing David away? He is your only son! You are going to give our money to that useless girl and a bunch of strangers?" The greed was visible in every twitch of her face. I looked at her, feeling a strange, cold peace settle over me. "My money goes to those who respect the value of hard work," I replied. "Not to those who are simply waiting for me to die so they can pay off their credit card debts." Rachel froze for a second, and then, like a cornered animal, she lunged toward me, waving the papers in the air. "You are old. You have lost your mind, haven't you?" she hissed, using the very words I had always feared. "Do you have any idea what we have had to endure living with you? If it were not for that house in Florida and the insurance money, I would not have spent a single second playing the part of the devoted daughter-in-law." She grabbed the porcelain vase from the table and hurled it against the floor, sending jagged shards flying everywhere. David stood in the doorway, his face pale as a ghost, but he did not move a muscle to stop his wife. Seeing the son I had nurtured and protected, now standing as a silent accomplice, made my chest feel like it was being crushed. Rachel bared her teeth and whispered, "If you do not sign the cancellation for this will, you won't be walking off this ship in one piece." Though my hands shook from the physical shock of her outburst, I forced myself to stand up and look Rachel directly in the eyes. "You think some broken pottery scares me? I have faced Category 10 storms at sea and looked into the eyes of the most ruthless smugglers. You are just a pathetic soul, blinded by your own greed." I carefully stepped around the broken porcelain and walked toward the door where David was still standing. I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the utter weakness of the man I had raised so poorly. "I am not signing anything," I said, "and from this moment on, I am the one who will protect myself." I walked out of that cabin, leaving behind the sound of Rachel's manic screaming and David's cowardly silence. I may be exhausted tonight, but my will is as hard as a diamond. I stepped out of that cabin and pulled the heavy door shut, hearing the lock click with the finality that echoed through the empty hallway. The air out here was different, sharp, salt-heavy, and carrying the low, rhythmic thrum of the ship's massive engines. It was a sound that usually lulled passengers into a sense of luxury, but for me, it acted like a wake-up call, shaking loose decades of professional dust. Rachel and David probably thought they were dealing with a fragile old woman who would retreat to her bed and cry into her pillow. But they had made a fatal mistake. They had forgotten that before I was a mother, before I was a widow, I was a field investigator for the United States Coast Guard. For 25 years, I had navigated the treacherous waters of the Florida Straits and handled people far more dangerous than a greedy daughter-in-law. I wasn't looking at this ship as a floating resort anymore. I was looking at it as a developing crime scene. Every polished railing, every security camera tucked into the molding, and every member of the crew was now a piece of a puzzle I was going to put back together to save my own life. My first move wasn't to run or hide. It was to document. I found a small gift shop on the lower deck that was still open, the kind of place that sells overpriced sunscreen and paperback thrillers. I bought a simple spiral-bound notebook and a classic black Parker pen. There is something about the weight of a real pen in your hand that grounds you. I found a secluded, dimly lit corner of the fourth-floor lounge, far away from the music and the clinking martini glasses, and I opened that first page. I wasn't Mrs. Gray, the heartbroken mother anymore. I was the lead investigator. I started a timeline, recreating every event with cold, clinical precision. I noted the date Rachel handed me the cruise tickets, the strange urgency in David's voice when he told me to cancel my meeting with my lawyer, and the exact location of cabin 8042, tucked away at the end of a long, dead-end corridor. I wrote down the exact angle of the safety latch I had found loosened on the balcony. I listed the red flags I had willfully ignored for months. The missing bank statements, the way David's eyes would shift when I asked about my savings, and finally, the forged signature on that life insurance policy. Professionalism is a powerful shield. It allowed me to take my pain and lock it in a box, replacing it with a sharp, focused logic I needed to protect the only witness I had left, myself. I knew I couldn't stay in the shadows forever, so I headed toward the bridge. I sent a quiet, urgent message to the captain's office for Marcus Webb. Marcus had been a young green sailor I had stood up for 15 years ago during a messy collision investigation in Miami. I had seen the honesty in him back then, and I had helped him keep his license when others wanted to scapegoat him. When he met me in his private office, his eyes widened with a mix of shock and immediate respect. He didn't see an old woman. He saw the officer who had saved his career. I didn't waste time with tears or long-winded explanations of my family's betrayal. I I simply laid out my notebook and showed him the photos I had taken of the forged insurance documents and the sabotaged door. Marcus went silent, his face hardening into a mask of grim authority. He looked at me and told me that on this ship, he was the law, and he promised me that nothing would happen to me under his watch. Hearing those words felt like being handed a life jacket in the middle of a gale. For the first time since boarding this ship, I felt the air actually reach the bottom of my lungs. Using the captain's secure encrypted Wi-Fi, I finally made contact with Harriet Donovan, my longtime maritime attorney back in Florida. I told her exactly what was happening and gave her the order I should have given months ago. I needed her to immediately freeze every single account and revoke the power of attorney I had foolishly granted to David. We worked through the middle of the night, drafting emergency notices to the insurance carriers and the banks, ensuring that even if I didn't make it back, they wouldn't see a dime of the blood money they were hunting. I even managed to record a brief, whispered conversation when David tried to corner me in the hallway later that night. He was trying to play the part of the apologetic son, but his questions were too pointed. He was fishing to see how much I knew. Every scrap of evidence, every recorded word, and every digital document was uploaded to a secure cloud server. I was building a fortress of facts, brick by brick, that no amount of Rachel's manipulation could ever tear down. I knew I had to get out of that isolated cabin immediately, but I had to do it without tipping them off. Working with the ship's chief medical officer, who was a close friend of Marcus, we staged a perfect exit. The next morning, I began the performance of a lifetime. I feigned a severe case of food poisoning, the kind of sudden, violent illness that is all too common and highly regulated on cruise ships. I made sure there was enough noise and enough of a scene that it couldn't be ignored. The doctor played his part perfectly, declaring that I needed to be moved to the high-security medical wing for observation and isolation to protect public health. When David and Rachel came rushing to the infirmary, they were stopped at the door by 2 stern security guards. They weren't allowed in because of quarantine protocols. Through the small reinforced glass window of the medical suite, I caught a glimpse of Rachel's face. It was twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She knew her window of opportunity to push me over a railing was closing, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it without exposing herself to the ship's authorities. Marcus had one more card to play, a move that Rachel never saw coming. While the ship was making a brief technical stop near Nassau to take on fuel, he arranged for me to be transferred to a Coast Guard-affiliated cargo vessel that was already on its way back to the Florida coast. It was labeled as an emergency medical evacuation, a perfectly legal and quiet maneuver. Before the medical team wheeled me out, I left a single handwritten note on the pillow of my old bed in cabin 8042. I wrote it with a deliberate, shaky hand, pretending to be the confused, sick old woman they wanted me to be. I told them I was too ill to continue and was going ahead for treatment, and that they should stay and enjoy the rest of their vacation. I knew the note would keep them guessing, just long enough for the distance between us to become unbridgeable. I wanted them to feel a flicker of doubt, a small taste of the uncertainty they had forced me to live with for years. The moment my feet touched the deck of that cargo ship, I felt a wave of peace that I hadn't known was possible. There were no plush carpets or velvet curtains here, just cold steel, massive shipping containers, and the honest smell of diesel and hard work. It felt like home. I sat on a simple metal bench and pulled out my phone, finally sending a short, honest text to Emma. I told her I was safe and that I was coming home to her soon. For the first time in a very long time, I was the one holding all the cards. I wasn't just a survivor. I was a woman who had reclaimed her dignity, and her strength. I realized that this whole ordeal wasn't just about saving my money or my life. It was about making things right. Every strategic step I had taken was a way of apologizing to the daughter I had ignored and proving to myself that I was still the strong, capable woman I used to be. I watched the luxury liner fade into a tiny speck on the horizon, knowing that when I finally saw David and Rachel again, it would be on my terms, in a courtroom, under the unforgiving light of the truth. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just ready to finish the investigation. The cargo ship docked at Nassau just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Caribbean Sea in shades of burnt orange and deep crimson. I stepped off the gangway, my legs still feeling a bit shaky from the days at sea and the constant, rhythmic thrum of the heavy engines. Among the noisy crowds of tourists in colorful shirts and local porters hauling luggage, I kept scanning the faces, my heart hammering against my ribs with an intensity I hadn't felt in years. I had sent Emma my coordinates as soon as I found a stable signal, but a cold fear still gnawed at the back of my mind. Would she really show up? Could she find enough grace in her heart to welcome back a mother who had treated her as a second-best option for 30 long years? "Mom! Mom!" That voice, so familiar and filled with a desperate urgency I knew I hadn't earned, cut through the terminal noise from behind the security fence. Emma was running toward me, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, and wearing that thin Target jacket I had once told her was completely lacking in style. She threw her arms around me, her breath coming in short, worried gasps that shook her entire frame. There were no words of blame, no sharp questions about why I was standing on a dusty cargo dock instead of a luxury liner. There was only her warmth and the faint, comforting scent of lavender in her hair that made me feel like I was finally on solid ground. "I booked the earliest Delta flight I could find the moment I got your message," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she held me tighter. "I was terrified thinking of you out there, on the water, alone with them. For the first time in my life, I felt small, protected by the very child I had always dismissed as weak and unremarkable." I buried my face in her shoulder and let the hot tears fall. Tears of deep, jagged regret and an overwhelming gratitude that I didn't know how to put into words. We eventually sat down at a small, weathered seaside cafe, where the sound of the waves felt like a gentle, reassuring hand on my shoulder. Emma didn't flinch or look away when I told her the whole truth about Rachel's mask slipping, about David's cowardly silence, and about that forged life insurance policy hidden in their luggage. Instead of being shocked or angry, she reached across the table and held my hand, her eyes filled with a quiet, steady intelligence I had never bothered to notice before. "Mom, I have had my suspicions for a long time," she said softly, her thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. "I saw the bank statements David was trying to hide in the back of the drawer when I went over to clean your place last month. I already prepared a file with copies of his tax records and bank alerts from the last few years to compare them." She pulled a folder from her bag, everything organized with the meticulous precision of a professional who spent her days managing archives. While I had been cheering for David's hollow, expensive successes, Emma had been silently watching over me, learning how to protect me in the only way she knew how. Her sharp mind had seen the financial holes David tried so hard to cover up, long before I did. I realized then, with a staggering clarity, that I wasn't alone in this investigation. My strongest and most capable ally was the very person I had neglected the most. "Emma, I have been so wrong about everything," I said, my voice trembling as I looked at the file she had worked so hard to gather in the dark. I spent my whole life building a monument for David, never realizing that you were the real foundation keeping this family from sinking. I owe you an apology that a lifetime won't be enough to finish, and I owe you the fairness you have deserved since you were a little girl." Emma just smiled, a sad but beautiful look of pure forgiveness that made my heart ache. "You don't owe me anything, Mom. I didn't do this for the money or to prove I was better than David. I did it because I love you, and I just wanted you to be safe." Her words were the only medicine my soul truly needed. Right then, with the sea breeze cooling my face, I took out my phone and called Harriet, my lawyer in Florida. "Harriet, I need you to add Emma to my estate trust as the primary beneficiary immediately," I told her, my voice finally sounding like the officer I used to be. "And I want you to prepare the paperwork to revoke David's inheritance entirely. I have finally found the person who is actually worthy of keeping what I have spent my life building." That night in Nassau, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I didn't have nightmares about isolated cabins or broken balcony latches. I slept soundly and deeply next to the daughter I had spent a lifetime underestimating. The next morning, as I watched Emma carefully organize my blood pressure medication and check our flight schedule back to Florida, I felt a new kind of power surging through my veins. Emma's presence didn't just provide me with evidence, it gave me a reason to fight for the truth. I wasn't finishing this investigation because of Rachel's betrayal anymore. I was doing it for Emma's future. Fairness wasn't just an abstract idea I had found on a cruise ship. It was Emma's face. It was her years of silent sacrifice. And it was the love she gave when I deserved it the least. With Emma by my side, I knew that whatever traps David and Rachel had waiting for us back home, we were going to walk through them together and come out stronger on the other side. Often, the one standing quietly by your side is your strongest support. Emma's forgiveness is powerful. But what will David's secret do to Mrs. Gray? We all have a silent hero in our families, someone who shows up when it matters most. Who is yours? Share your story below, and let's honor those who keep us going together. The door to our home in Florida clicked shut behind Emma and me, sealing us inside with the heavy, stifling heat of the Gulf Coast. This house, which had once felt like a sanctuary of my own making, was where I used to proudly display David's diplomas like war medals on the walls. Now, the atmosphere felt unnervingly cold, as if the air conditioning was trying to scrub away the scent of a brewing crime. I no longer saw these rooms as a home. I saw them as a scene filled with the invisible fingerprints of a long, calculated deception. Emma set her laptop down on the heavy oak dining table, her eyes steady and filled with a resolve I had never truly respected until now. She told me we needed to go through everything before they made it back from the port in Miami. I simply nodded, feeling the old, dormant instincts of a Coast Guard investigator rising to the surface, effectively numbing the jagged, raw ache of being a betrayed mother. Emma began the process of peeling back the layers of David's supposed success, logging into the archives and financial databases she had been quietly monitoring. She showed me the real reason behind that luxury cruise. The screen was flooded with red, delinquent notices from major banks like Chase and Wells Fargo. David, the son I had trusted as a brilliant financial advisor, was actually drowning in over $250,000 of debt. It wasn't business expansion. It was a disastrous string of failed cryptocurrency investments and the crushing weight of Rachel's vanity. Emma showed me the itemized notes she had taken. Rachel had a $12,000 credit card debt from Saks Fifth Avenue alone, and David had taken out a secret $80,000 second mortgage on his home that was currently facing foreclosure. I stared at those numbers until my hands began to shake. Every time he had come to me asking for money to grow his firm, I was actually just pouring my hard-earned savings into a bottomless pit of greed. My own favoritism had been the very fuel that kept his engine of lies running for all these years. The most devastating piece of evidence appeared when we searched a hidden lockbox Emma found tucked away behind the dusty encyclopedias in David's old study. It was the original life insurance policy from Oceanic Life. The details were written in cold, clinical ink. The insured was Margaret Gray. The sole beneficiary was Rachel Gray. The payout for an accidental death at sea was $500,000, and the policy had been activated exactly 2 days before we set sail. I reached out and touched the name Margaret Gray at the bottom of the page. The signature was a meticulous forgery, but with my years of training, I could see the tiny, telltale tremors in the ink where the hand had hesitated. It was David's handwriting. He had personally signed his own mother's death warrant just to salvage his hollow reputation. A wave of pure, physical disgust rose in my throat, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. I whispered to Emma that my own son had actually put a price tag of $500,000 on my life. The search didn't stop there. Emma opened the browser history on the shared tablet David always used when he came to visit. The search terms were like a series of daggers aimed directly at my heart. He had been looking up how to sabotage a cruise ship balcony latch without leaving a trace. He had searched for high-dose sedatives that could be easily dissolved in red wine. He had spent hours researching Florida inheritance laws regarding victims missing at sea and looking for quick debt collection services in Nassau. At that moment, any lingering hope I had that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding vanished into the humid Florida air. This wasn't a sudden impulse. It was a carefully choreographed execution. They had calculated which wine I would drink and how the winds in Nassau would help cover their tracks. The realization was an earthquake to my soul. I had spent 30 years nurturing a predator with the very love I had stolen from my other child. I turned to look at Emma, who was still working the keys with trembling hands. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner. She stopped, looking at me with eyes that were suddenly overflowing with years of suppressed pain. She reminded me of last Christmas, when she tried to mention David's financial struggles, and I had snapped at her, calling her jealous and bitter. I had told her she should try being more useful instead of constantly picking at her brother. She said she stayed silent because she knew that without this undeniable, iron-clad proof, I would have chosen to believe David was an angel and she was just the resentful daughter. Her words left me speechless. The injustice I had inflicted wasn't just about the money I spent on David. It was the way I had systematically stripped Emma of her voice and her right to protect her own mother. I wiped away the last of my tears, letting the weakness of the mother fade so the cold precision of the investigator could take over. I told Emma to copy everything. We sent one digital bundle to Harriet, my lawyer, and another to Captain Marcus on the ship, and we kept the final set for the police. We had everything we needed: the debt records, the forged policy, the criminal search history, and the secret recordings I had made in Nassau. These weren't just legal documents anymore. They were the tools of my restoration. David and Rachel were on their way back, likely rehearsing their roles as the grieving family of a mother lost at sea. They had no idea that the Margaret Gray they thought they knew had already died on that ship. The woman standing in this dark living room was someone who had finally woken up, and I was ready to let justice do its work. We sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the Florida moon filtering through the heavy blinds. I watched Emma as she finally drifted off to sleep, slumped over the piles of evidence on the table. I realized then that the fairness I had to establish wasn't just about putting criminals in jail. It was about handing Emma back the dignity and the standing she had lost because of my blindness. The disgust I felt for David was still there, heavy and cold, but it had been transformed into a silent, strategic plan. I wasn't acting out of hatred anymore. I was simply cleaning up the wreckage of a life built on a lie. The truth was out in the open now, and it was finally time for the curtain to fall on their performance. The Florida dawn began to creep through the gaps in the palm fronds outside, casting thin, weak slivers of light across the living room after a long, sleepless night spent wrestling with those deceitful numbers. Emma had finally drifted off to sleep beside the mountain of documents on the dining table, her breathing steady but heavy with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I moved quietly, my joints aching, as I walked to the old wooden shelf where Thomas's photograph stood in its place of honor. His Coast Guard uniform crisp, and his expression stern, yet undeniably kind. I reached out and touched the cool glass of the frame with a trembling hand, feeling as though I were searching for a safe harbor, now that my ship of faith in David had completely vanished into the cold, dark depths of the ocean. Thomas was always the one who kept the compass for this family. I remembered the long, quiet afternoons he spent sitting out on the porch, carefully polishing his old brass compass with a soft cloth until it shone. He used to tell me that on the sea, or in the middle of a life, if the needle is off by even a single degree, the ship will eventually end up in a very dark, dangerous place. Back then, I just laughed and told him he was being too rigid, too much of a sailor. But now, looking back at how I poured every ounce of my affection and my savings into David while leaving Emma in the shadows, I realize I let my own compass drift dangerously far from the truth. Thomas had always looked at Emma with a quiet, knowing pride whenever she fixed her own bicycle or spent hours silently tending to the garden, while I was too busy staring at David's shiny, hollow accolades. I opened the small drawer beneath his photograph and pulled out his old silver pocket watch, the metal still smooth from years of him carrying it. Inside the lid, he had engraved the names of both our children. But there was a tiny detail I had never truly noticed until this moment of clarity. Behind Emma's name, he had etched a small symbol of an anchor, the mark of something steadfast and unmoving. Thomas knew. He had seen the strength and the unwavering loyalty in our youngest daughter since she was just a little girl. He had quietly prepared her to be the one who kept the fire burning in this house for the day I inevitably lost my way. That feeling of being loved and guided from beyond the grave felt like a cool stream of water washing over my parched heart, helping the disgust I felt for David finally begin to fade into a cold, hard resolve. I whispered to his image that I finally understood. The fairness I was about to establish was not just a punishment for a son who had betrayed me. It was the act of bringing the compass needle back to its true heading. I looked over at Emma as she stirred in her sleep, the morning sun resting gently on her tired shoulders. My determination no longer felt like a hot, burning rage. It felt like the deep, silent stillness of the ocean after a massive storm has finally passed. I was going to protect Thomas's legacy and Emma's integrity, and I was going to put a definitive end to the lies that had been hidden under the name of family. A strange sense of peace settled over me, because I realized that for this final confrontation, I was no longer walking alone. The screech of tires on the gravel driveway of our Florida home sounded like a sharp, jagged warning. I tightened my grip on Emma's hand, feeling the steady warmth of my youngest daughter as the final anchor before the real storm broke over us. I had been waiting for this moment, preparing my heart and my mind. Yet seeing David's luxury SUV pull up to the front door still made my heart hammer against my ribs. It wasn't that I was afraid for my life anymore. It was the realization that the very last mask of family and motherly love was about to be torn away by the cold, sharp edges of legal documents. I took a slow breath, trying to stay grounded as the engine cut out and a heavy, expectant silence settled over the yard. The front door swung open with a violence that made the hinges groan. Rachel marched in first, her face a mask of high drama, followed by David, whose skin looked like gray ash. Behind them walked a man in a stiff, dark suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase, a lawyer. There was no hug, no sigh of relief, no question of how I had managed to get home safely. Rachel lunged toward me, her voice rising in a practiced, shrill pitch that echoed off the walls. "Mother, do you have any idea how sick with worry we have been?" she cried out, her eyes darting around the room like she was looking for a stage to perform on. "The doctors on the ship told us you were having a mental breakdown from the poisoning, that you wandered off in a state of complete confusion." She turned to the man in the suit, gesturing toward me as if I were a broken piece of furniture. "This is Mr. Miller," she continued. "He is here to help us finalize the guardianship papers. You need specialized care, Margaret. You clearly are no longer capable of making your own decisions about your health or your finances." The sheer sense of violation made me tremble, a cold fire of outrage burning in my veins. They were trying to erase me in my own home, to turn me into a shadow, a person without a will or a voice. Rachel pulled the set of papers with a bright red county court seal from the briefcase and held them out. "We have already filed for an emergency mental competency evaluation," she said. "David is the eldest son, and he has the power of attorney you signed 2 years ago. From this moment on, all your bank accounts and your estate will be managed by us to protect you from being manipulated by people who don't have your best interests at heart." She threw a sharp, condescending look at Emma, her lip curling in a sneer. They were taking the very trust I had once placed in David and turning it into a set of shackles. David stood near the doorway, refusing to meet my eyes as he stared at the floor, his voice a low, hollow mumble. "Mom, this is really for your own good," he said, and the gaslighting in his tone made my stomach turn. "You have started seeing conspiracies that just aren't there. You actually think we wanted to hurt you? And that kind of paranoia is a classic sign of early-stage dementia." Hearing those words from the son I had always prioritized over my own needs felt like a vast, empty canyon opening up beneath my feet. A wave of helplessness started to rise like a dark tide, threatening to pull me under. But just as I felt my knees might buckle, Emma's hand squeezed mine with the strength I hadn't known she possessed. She stepped forward, standing tall and looking directly at Miller. "You have absolutely no right to perform any kind of evaluation here without my mother's own legal representation present," she said. "She is exactly right." A sharp, commanding voice rang out from the porch. Harriet Donovan stepped through the door, a thick, heavy file folder tucked under her arm. "I am Harriet, Mrs. Gray's attorney," she said, her presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. "And we have quite a bit of news for all of you." Harriet walked to the dining table and began laying out documents with a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt like justice finally taking its seat. First of all, the power of attorney that David is currently holding was legally revoked the moment Mrs. Gray stepped off that ship in Nassau. Second, we have already filed a countersuit for the blatant forgery of her signature on that life insurance policy, and for senior financial abuse. Rachel turned as pale as a ghost, her mouth opening to argue, but Harriet held up a hand to silence her. And most importantly, we have the results of an independent psychiatric evaluation from the Central Hospital performed just this afternoon. Mrs. Gray is completely lucid and of sound mind. The only people facing serious legal consequences here are the two of you. I stood up, and for the first time in decades, the trembling in my hands was gone. I felt the unbreakable resilience of someone who had finally found the true heading on her compass. I looked at David, seeing the son I had given everything to, only to receive the ultimate betrayal in return. David, I gave you everything because I thought that was what love looked like, I said, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of 30 years of truth. But today, I realize that fairness is what you actually need. And fairness starts with you being held responsible for exactly what you signed. Rachel looked like she was about to lunge at Emma in a fit of manic rage, but I stepped in front of my daughter, my back straight and my eyes cold. Get out of my house immediately, I told them. You will never touch me, my property, or Emma ever again. The investigation is over, and the truth is the only thing left standing in this room. Seeing children use the law to steal your life's work is a pain beyond words. Do you believe integrity still triumphs over such schemes? Share your thoughts below as we support Mrs. Gray in reclaiming her life. Let's stand together for truth and justice. Who else believes the truth always wins in the end? The night before the hearing at the county courthouse, the house in Florida was so quiet I could hear the small sounds I usually ignored, like the hum of the refrigerator and the dry, rhythmic rustle of the palm fronds against the porch screen. After the explosive confrontation with Rachel and that lawyer she brought over, this silence didn't feel lonely like it used to. It felt like the heavy, expectant air right before a storm breaks, or the way the ocean holds its breath before the tide turns. I sat out on the porch in the humid night air, my hand wrapped around a glass of iced tea where the ice had long since melted into nothing. I watched the warm yellow light spilling out from the living room window where Emma and Harriet Donovan were still working. They were bent over the dining table, meticulously double-checking every single line of our countersuit. Everything was in place, yet I could feel these tiny, persistent ripples in my chest. A lingering ache for the family bond that was now broken beyond any hope of repair. Harriet eventually stepped out onto the porch, her movements slow and deliberate as she set a thin manila folder on the wicker table between us. She looked at me with a professional kindness and told me that we had every piece of the puzzle. We had the official logs from Captain Marcus regarding my emergency medical transfer, the forensic results from the handwriting expert proving the signatures were forged, and the digital paper trail showing David's attempts to change the beneficiary info on my policies. Seeing it all there, documented in cold black ink on white paper, felt like looking at a map of a betrayal I had walked into with my eyes wide shut. We spent hours talking about the strategy for tomorrow. Harriet wanted to highlight how Rachel had manipulated the documents, but I found myself pushing for something deeper. I told her I wanted the judge to see the systemic unfairness I had shown Emma for 30 years. I wanted them to see that this case wasn't just about a life insurance policy or a piece of real estate in a coastal town. It was about restoring the standing of the child who had stayed in the shadows to protect me while I was busy worshiping a son who was plotting my end. This wasn't about revenge for me. It was about a necessary, logical correction of a life that had been off course for far too long. When Harriet finally said her goodnights and drove away, Emma came out to sit in the chair beside me. I looked at my daughter's hands in the dim porch light. Her long, graceful fingers were usually only stained with the dust of old library archives, but tonight they were red and cramped from hours of taking notes and organizing legal exhibits for my defense. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, folded document, a new trust agreement I had spent the afternoon drafting with Harriet's guidance. I told her softly that I was moving the management of the entire investment portfolio and this very house into her name. I could see the protest forming on her lips, the humble instinct to decline that I had reinforced in her for years. I reached out and touched her hand, telling her that this wasn't a gift, and it certainly wasn't a reward for saving me. It was fairness. I told her that David had already spent his inheritance through decades of my blind, biased generosity. Tomorrow, in front of the judge and in front of her brother, I was going to make this public. I wanted the world to see that she was the only one with the integrity to hold the legacy her father had left behind. Looking into her tear-filled eyes, I felt a massive, crushing weight lift off my shoulders. Favoritism is a toxic thing that poisons everyone it touches, but making the right choice felt like finally finding clear water. I found myself thinking about David one last time before I tried to get some sleep. He was probably sitting in that expensive rented apartment with Rachel right now, both of them frantically trying to figure out how to spin the evidence or find a loophole in the law. I realized with a start that I didn't feel the burning, jagged hatred I thought would be there. Instead, I just felt a profound, weary sense of pity. I felt sorry for him, because my own overprotection and my own refusal to see his flaws had turned him into a weak, hollow man who was easily led by his wife's bottomless greed. Tomorrow, I would have to look him in the eye and tell the absolute truth, and I knew it would be the most painful thing I had ever done as a mother. But it was the only way to save what was left of my own soul. I went into my bedroom and smoothed out the navy blue suit I had laid out for the morning. It was a professional, sharp outfit, the same color I used to wear when I represented the Coast Guard. I wasn't going to that courthouse to win a fight or to hurt my son. I was going there to deliver a final, honest verdict that I should have reached years ago. Tonight, I knew I would sleep soundly, because no matter what happened in that courtroom, I had finally found my way back to the woman Thomas loved, and the daughter I had almost lost. The Palm Beach sky was an impossible, piercing blue that morning, the kind of clear, heavy brightness that only a Florida winter can produce. But as I stood in the women's restroom of the county courthouse, the radiant sunshine outside felt worlds away from the clinical, bone-chilling air produced by the building's massive hum of an air conditioning system. I looked at myself in the mirror and carefully smoothed the lapels of my navy blue blazer. It was the most professional, authoritative piece of clothing I owned, a color that reminded me of the decades I spent in uniform representing the Coast Guard. Beside me, Emma reached out and placed a steady, warm hand on my shoulder, her reflection offering a silent strength that I had ignored for far too long. She asked me if I was ready, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a confused widow or a mother desperate for her son's approval. I looked at the lines on my face and saw the investigator I used to be, the woman who knew how to spot a lie in the dark and hold a steady course through a gale. I simply nodded, taking a slow, deep breath to steady the very last tremor of a mother's heartbreak before we stepped out to face the truth. The sound of my heels and Harriet's brisk professional footsteps echoed with a rhythmic, military precision against the polished marble of the courthouse corridor. As we pushed open the heavy double doors of courtroom 4B, the atmosphere shifted instantly, becoming thick with a cold, predatory tension radiating from the table on the far side of the room. David was sitting there, his eyes fixed firmly on a scratched spot on the mahogany table, his fingers nervously shredding a small white napkin into tiny, jagged pieces. Rachel, however, was a different story. She had traded her expensive resort wear for a high-collared, severe black dress, a costume clearly intended to portray the grieving, worried daughter-in-law. When she saw me walk in with Emma and Harriet, her eyebrows shot up in a look of defiant arrogance. She still believed that her petition to have me declared mentally incompetent was the master key that would unlock my retirement accounts and solve their mounting debts. She didn't realize that in this room, justice wasn't based on a scripted performance. It was built on the cold, hard foundation of evidence. Judge Miller, a woman with silver hair and eyes as sharp and unforgiving as a razor, struck her gavel to open the hearing, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hushed room. David's lawyer stood first, launching into a rehearsed, syrupy speech about my supposed cognitive decline. He spoke about my mysterious disappearance on the cruise ship and my sudden irrational behavior, painting a picture of a woman who was a danger to herself and her own estate. He argued that David, as the devoted eldest son, was the only one capable of serving as my legal guardian to protect what remained of my legacy. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting, a coordinated attempt to turn my own history and my own body against me. But Harriet didn't interrupt or object. She sat with a calm, predatory stillness, waiting for him to finish weaving his web of lies before she finally stood up. Harriet didn't offer a long, emotional speech. Instead, she produced a small silver thumb drive and asked the court for permission to present evidence regarding the true nature of my disappearance. The room went silent as the high-quality speakers of the courtroom crackled to life. It was Rachel's voice, distorted but unmistakable, screaming in the cabin about needing to do something because I was planning to give my money to strangers and veterans. Then, Harriet submitted a sworn affidavit from Captain Marcus Webb, detailing the sabotaged safety latch on the balcony of cabin 8042 and the coordinated efforts to move me to safety. I watched Rachel's face turn from a pale porcelain white to a sickly mottled gray. David seemed to physically collapse, his head dropping into his hands as his shoulders began to shake with the weight of the realization that their meticulously planned trap had been turned inside out. The judge looked over her glasses at me and asked if I had anything I wished to say to the court. I stood up, feeling a strange, quiet power radiating from the floorboards beneath my feet. I looked directly at Judge Miller, and then I turned my head to look at David, the son I had cherished and favored above all else. I told the court that I had spent 30 years believing I was doing the right thing for my son by giving him everything he ever asked for. I admitted that I had been blind, that my own favoritism had accidentally nurtured the very greed and cruelty that led us to this room. I stopped for a moment, feeling a sharp, familiar ache in my chest, but I refused to let it pull me down. I told them I wasn't there to ask for my money back or for an apology. I was there to protect my right to live with dignity and to finally restore the standing of my daughter Emma, the only person who had risked everything to save me, without ever expecting a single penny of an inheritance. In that moment, I saw Emma smile through her tears, and it felt like the final link of a heavy, invisible chain was being snapped. Judge Miller didn't hesitate. She struck her gavel one final time, the sound final and hollow as it filled the room. She announced that the court was denying David Gray's petition for guardianship in its entirety, stating that I was clearly of sound mind and fully capable of managing my own affairs. She then turned her gaze toward David and Rachel, her expression becoming as cold as the Atlantic in winter. She stated that based on the evidence of insurance fraud, forgery, and the attempted harm of a senior citizen, the court was referring the matter to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office for an immediate criminal investigation. She ordered that all of my accounts be permanently frozen to anyone but myself and Harriet. And she warned David and Rachel that any further contact with me would be considered a violation of a standing protection order. Rachel tried to stand up, her mouth opening to scream another lie, but a bailiff stepped forward and forced her back into her seat. David stayed exactly where he was, a broken statue of a man who had traded his mother's life for a debt he could never pay. I turned my back on them and walked out of that courtroom without looking back once. As we stepped through the heavy glass doors and back out into the Florida heat, the warm, salt-tinged air felt like a benediction. I took a long, deep breath, smelling the sea and the cut grass, feeling the weight of the last few months finally dissolving into the afternoon light. Harriet shook my hand with a look of genuine respect, and Emma pulled me into a hug that felt like the first honest thing I had touched in years. For the first time in a very long time, I felt truly free. Justice had been delivered, not through a need for revenge, but by simply putting the world back on its true heading. David would have to face the cold reality of the law, but Emma and I were going to start over, building something new on a foundation of truth and mutual respect. The compass of my life had finally found its true north. 6 months have passed since that life-altering afternoon in the Palm Beach County Courthouse. Today, my kitchen is filled with the warm, spicy scent of pumpkin pie and the rich, savory aroma of a roasting turkey, the smells of a real Thanksgiving. David and Rachel are far away now, fulfilling their court-ordered legal obligations and attending the mandatory psychological rehabilitation programs the judge insisted upon. I do not carry the heavy, jagged weight of resentment in my heart anymore, but I have finally learned how to draw the firm lines necessary to protect my own peace. Every afternoon, I no longer find myself standing alone by the sea, desperately searching the horizon for a shred of validation from a son who only valued my bank account. Instead, I sit here on this very porch, feeling the cool breeze. And I am not alone. I am with Emma. Emma just recently finished her certification in historical estate appraisal, and she is currently helping me organize the small family library we have kept for years. Watching her laugh so brightly beside Captain Marcus, who has truly become a dear and trusted friend to this family, I have come to realize that family is not just about the blood that runs through your veins. It is about the people who are willing to stand directly in the path of the storm to keep you from being swept away. The compass needle in my heart has finally settled into its true, balanced position. I am no longer a victim waiting for permission to be happy. I am the master of my own joy. Mrs. Gray's story comes to an end here, but I truly believe its echo will linger in our hearts for a long time. We have walked with her through the crushing pain of betrayal, the agonizing shock of favoritism, and finally, her powerful, hard-won liberation. Mrs. Gray has taught us all a vital lesson. Fairness is not just about dividing up physical possessions or money. It is the courage to see and cherish the most authentic values, even when they are buried under layers of expensive, artificial glitter. To all the mothers and grandmothers listening, loving your children is a sacred calling, but protecting your own dignity and integrity is a responsibility you owe to your own life. Do not let a blind favoritism hide the quiet gems that have been standing right beside you all along. Remember that you are worthy of love simply for who you are, not for what you might eventually leave behind in a will. I hope that each of you finds that sense of peace and true fairness within your own home. How do you feel now that we have reached the end of Mrs. Gray's journey? Is there a specific detail that resonated with your own life, or a lesson you want to pass on to your loved ones? Please share your thoughts and your stories about the silent heroes in your life in the comments. Casey is always here to listen and connect with all of you.